At this point, I want to broaden the problem of the limits of autonomy by considering decision-making by parents rather than first parties. Parents sometimes refuse a treatment that, from the point of view of good medical practice standards, their child must receive or face death. Should these refusals of treatment be accepted? In a second scenario I want now to consider, parents who are Jehovah's Witnesses refuse a blood transfusion for their 2-year-old child. The parents straightforwardly say that they elevate spiritual purity and healing over medical healing. A surgeon and hospital lawyers state that the parents do not have a right to make a decision with fatal consequences for their child. They recognize that these parents are the legally authorized representatives of the child, but they believe that the parent's autonomy should nonetheless be overridden. Consider here again 2 rules that conflict in this second scenario. The first is the rule that it's morally prohibited to risk death for a patient if his or her life-threatening condition can be treated by suitable medical techniques. The second is that it's morally prohibited to disrespect a parental refusal of treatment. Although parents frequently do refuse treatment for their children in general, the right to refuse when the child faces serious illness or death is far weaker and more subject to qualification than it was in the case of the 22-year-old man. One plausible way to understand rights of parental decision-making is to say that it's morally prohibited to disrespect a parental refusal of treatment unless the refusal constitutes child abuse, child neglect, or violates a right of the child. Under this interpretation of the rule, it states that health professionals are only generally required to respect parental refusals of treatment, and that there are valid exceptions. Assuming now that this understanding of the applicable moral rule is correct, what action should be performed in the case of the 2-year-old? My view is a strong one. I think it is morally required, not merely morally permitted, to disrespect this parental refusal of treatment, precisely because the refusal does constitute a form of child abuse, child endangerment, child neglect, or inattention to the rights of the child. Jehovah's Witnesses parents who refuse life-saving blood transfusions for their minor children have been widely considered in bioethics as overreaching their parental authority. I accept this conclusion, but it also must be acknowledged that this judgment denying parents the right to decide needs more justification than I can offer in this forum. Certainly it would be disputed that health professionals are morally required to override the judgments of these parents. To put this issue in perspective, legislative bodies around the world have, over the course of the last century, wavered and frequently reversed themselves over the issue of parental rights. They have, on the one hand, passed statutes that allow for so-called religious exemptions that permit spiritual healing and parental decisions to prevail over medical treatment decisions. On the other hand, when parents subsequently make judgments that place their children's lives in danger, these legislatures began to temper or rescind the very religious exemptions they previously allowed. A 5-4 decision of the United States Supreme Court in 1944 held that a Jehovah's Witness parent could not neglect the education of her 9-year-old child by compelling the child to preach on the streets and to sell religious magazines on the streets. The court found that rights of religious expression are not absolute or beyond limitation, and that a child cannot be subjected by a parent to a poor education, to communicable disease, to ill health, or to death. The court's opinion states that religious and personal principles and practices must yield to sober medical judgment when they seriously affect the welfare and health of children. If a child faces a circumstance of serious risk, a decision to withhold medical care can amount to parental abuse or neglect, even if the parent's reason is religious in nature. The court's perspective is a clear example of a justified limitation placed on rights of autonomy in medical practice.